Good morning. I'm Leann Birch, and I have the pleasure of moderating our first session of the meeting. We really felt that it was particularly appropriate to start this meeting by sort of laying the context for what we know about consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and also what we know about the consumption of water, and how we might look at the results of some modeling that's been done already on potential shifts that we might be able to make. So we've got 4 speakers, and I'll come back and talk a bit more about that in a moment. I think one of the pieces that I really want to spend a couple of minutes on is helping us remember some things about our little consumers and their relationship to sweet. And I think I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about that at risk of preaching to the converted here. Remember that we're talking about birth to 5, and during this period, children are learning a lot of things. There's a lot of major milestones that happen. They're learning about food and eating, and I think as Americans, we tend not to think about this too much, but children have to learn what things are edible, what things are food or drinks. They learn food preferences, aversions, they learn how to eat, they learn how to use tools to eat with, they learn how much to eat, and they learn which cues in the environment control initiating and terminating meals. That's a lot. And all that happens in the first years of life. In fact, that transition is relatively complete by the end of the second year of life. So that as mammals, while we start life consuming a single drink, actually, milk, as omnivores, by the age of about 2, they have to be able to consume a varied diet. And I think in general, we don't pay enough attention to this. And we'll see that what is learned is going to be different depending on the culture, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, feeding practices, and what foods happen to be available. A couple of years ago, the New York Times did a really wonderful article in the magazine on a breakfast around the world for kids, and they looked at a bunch of 3-year-olds and what they were eating, and to illustrate the point that kids learn to eat whatever is available. You can see here that we have a child in Japan who's eating stir-fried green peppers with dried fish and soy sauce for breakfast. We have in Malawi kids who are eating fried corn fritters with chili, onions, and garlic, and cooked pumpkin and potatoes. And then we have a little girl in Iceland who's eating something that looks more familiar to many of us, which is a bowl of oatmeal with some raisins and some milk. Okay. They're all drinking different things, and they've all learned how to eat those things very early, and it all comes from what's going on in the home and the family setting. So part of what we need to do, I think, is some serious consciousness raising with parents, particularly if we want kids to drink more water, for example. Now, fortunately, kids come equipped to be able to learn to eat whatever's available. There are some constraints, and I think these are really key, and that is that the responses to basic tastes are pretty much hardwired, particularly the sweet preference and sour and bitter. You can see right at birth that you get this "he likes it" kind of expression to sweet, whereas you get the tongue protrusions and rejection responses in terms of the taste or flavor coming back out of the mouth with sour and bitter. In contrast, though, our food and flavor preferences are learned. And this takes time. It doesn't happen instantly, but it happens relatively rapidly and pretty early, and involves a number of different kinds of learning processes, including just becoming familiar with the things that are there, having opportunities to try things repeatedly. We learn to associate foods with particular context, consequences, with other flavors. And we watch others eat, and we learn that way as well. There we go. So this is a very old example of what you can see happen over time with learning. You've got a baby who initially, when given some green beans, isn't very responsive other than to spit them out. And then what we see here is a graph of the exposure. So initially there's the intake. There's essentially no intake here. This is frequency of exposure. After a couple of weeks, you see the same baby with the same food being presented, leaning forward, looking anxious to take a bite. But it takes 2 or 3 weeks, could take 10, 15, 20 exposures to get that to happen. So people have to kind of hang in there to see this kind of a response to a green vegetable, for example. In contrast, sweets are liked right off the bat. All right, we don't have to do any learning. And I'm not sure if I can start this from here. Can you start this back there? This is a video of 2 videos. One of a baby with the first response to what we'd call a dum-dum, just a simple sugar lollipop. Second is to a sweet solution. Sweet solution that's used for analgesic purposes in medical procedures. That's it. So you see, it's there, and you don't have to make it happen. Kids don't have to learn to like it. So that's what we're up against. If you want kids to drink water instead of sugar-sweetened beverages. And it's interesting that, the current guidance is that kids shouldn't have water until about 6 months, but they often have juice before that time. So juice is already there competing. So as I said, the liking for sweet is present at birth. It evolved in scarcity. It was adaptive at that point. Signal for fruits, for example. Babies don't have to learn to like it. It's an unconditioned stimulus for ingestion. It goes into the mouth, babies swallow. Okay. It leads to endogenous opioid release and can blunt pain. It's used to blunt the pain of heel stick procedures, circumcision procedures, and so on. So it's very powerful stuff. So recently, Sam Giddings and Julie Minella wrote a commentary that asked, has the world become too sweet? And I've summarized some of this. That sweet clearly is no longer scarce. It's widely available. It's added to many foods and drinks, particularly many foods and drinks that are fed to this age group. Their predisposition to sweet makes them very vulnerable to these poor food choices. And the fact is that what happens is that sweet things can actually displace other foods in the diet, especially early on when other foods are unfamiliar and are not going to be liked. So the competition is really stacked in favor of kids learning to like and eat sweet things before they've had the opportunity to learn to like other more complex foods and flavors. Thanks very much. I want to just say that we're now going to move on to our other speakers. The first is going to be Anna Maria Ciega-Reese from the University of Virginia, who's going to talk about what we know from the NHANES data on early beverage consumption patterns. Mary Story from Duke University is going to be talking about the recent Feeding Infants and Toddlers study findings on beverage consumption. Steve Gortmaker from Harvard is going to be talking about modeling the effects of a couple of strategies that look very promising. And finally, Christina Hecht from UC Berkeley's California Nutrition Policy Institute is going to talk about drinking water. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ciega-Reese.